The Hand of the Necromancer by Brad Strickland, Chapter 2. The professor's plan to help Johnny get a job came off with only two minor hitches. First, Miss Farrington agreed to take Johnny on only temporarily, until he proved that he could do the routine work in the museum. Johnny thought that would be no problem. Mr. Haskins, the old janitor, had worked until he was 81. In Johnny's opinion, if he couldn't do at least as much dusting, sweeping, and mopping as an 80-year-old man, he just wasn't trying. The second small change in the plan was that Professor Childermass let Miss Farrington have everything except the carved wooden hand. After Johnny's experience, the professor was suspicious about its innocence. Although Johnny and he had tried several times to make it move again by mentioning Estrius Blackleach's name, it remained just a dead piece of wood. Johnny began to wonder if he had only imagined its movement. Still, the professor decided he had better investigate the relic more fully. Johnny began to work on a Monday morning. His trial period would be 1 month, and during that time he would earn $10 a week for working 4 hours a day, Monday through Friday. He began to ponder what he could buy with the extra cash. For a week everything went well, or as well as could be expected with Miss Farrington as his boss. She was a sour-faced woman who kept her steel gray hair in a tight bun, and she peered at the world through thick glasses. She always complained about something, and even when she could find no fault with Johnny's work, she would never compliment him. A frosty, I suppose that will do, was as much as he could expect from her. The Gudge Museum was a federal-style building on the north side of West Merrimack Street. It had been built in 1790 as the home of Parson Randolph Gudge of the First Congregational Church, and later became the home of the parson's granddaughter, the poet Sophia Peabody. The poet Sophonsoba Peabody. In fact, Johnny thought, if Miss Farrington had her way, the museum would be called the Museum of the Great, Wonderful, Underappreciated American Poet, Sophonsoba Peabody. Sophonsoba Peabody had lived from 1812 to 1886, and Miss Farrington was a descendant of hers. Miss Farrington did not care about any part of the museum except the Sophia Peabody room, and she was always trying to buy furniture and clothing and personal articles that had once belonged to old Sophia. Sophia had written long, soupy poems about nature and selfless love. She had known the Massachusetts poet John Greenleaf Whittier, who even in old age used to run 3 or 4 blocks out of his way to avoid having to talk to her. The room dedicated to her memory was crammed full of delicate, fragile items that absolutely could not be touched, but that had to be kept clean. Johnny could do without the Peabody room, though he liked most of the other exhibits in the museum. The professor's box full of witchy items, minus the wooden hand, wound up on the 3rd floor of the museum in the Colonial Curiosities room. This room was the only display area on the stuffy, dusty 3rd floor, where all the other rooms were storage spaces. The Curiosities room displayed colonial household items and homemade crafts on shelves and tables, and the Blackleach exhibit had a whole set of shelves to itself. The walls were decorated with antique framed quilts that pioneer women had stitched by hand. At 1 p.m. on Friday, Johnny had just finished dusting the Curiosities room, which he privately called the Witch Room. This was his last task before he would receive his first pay envelope. He put up his broom, dustpan, and feather duster, wondering what he would do with all that money. He paused before the Blackleach shelves and picked up the snow globe. It now had a card in front of it reading, "Handmade snow globe, made by the early settler Estrius Blackleach, 1690. This is the earliest American example of this type of craft." Since Johnny had knocked the globe off Professor Childermass's desk, it had an additional feature. This was a hairline crack where the glass joined the wooden base. It was not more than a half-inch long and almost invisible. The crack did not appear to go all the way through the glass because no water was leaking out. Well, at least the globe still worked. Johnny inverted the snow dome, swirled it, and watched the blizzard sweep around the poor traveler inside. The little figure was too small to have a real face, but somehow Johnny imagined it with a look of terror as it desperately tried to reach the safety of the log cabin. Something was after the fleeing figure, something horrible rushing from the woods. It was bounding along on silent paws, and its slathering jaws gaped open too. "Ah! Another fancier of colonial antiquities." The sly, hoarse voice made Johnny jump a mile, and almost made him drop the globe a second time. He thrust it back on the shelf and spun to confront the visitor, who had come silently up behind him. The man was skinny and tall and completely bald, with dark, deep-set eyes. He wore an old black suit, a white shirt that looked faintly yellow with age, and a narrow black silk tie. He smiled, showing a mouthful of crooked brown-stained teeth. "My," he said in his hoarse voice, "what an industrious young fellow, tidying up the exhibits. Do you by any chance work here, young man?" Johnny swallowed hard and nodded. "Ah, wonderful," the stranger grated. "I understand that somewhere in this establishment are some, curiosities. Am I correct?" That is going to be a hard voice to do for the rest of this book. "Well, we have a lot of exhibits," Johnny said. "There's the Colonial Life Room on the first floor, and the Sofa. Bah!" The stranger almost spat the word out. Then he gave Johnny another twisted smile. "No, I mean artifacts specifically related to, the practice of witchcraft." Sure," Johnny stammered. "This is the Curiosities Room. We have some things that used to belong to Estrius Blackleach." The strange man smiled a ghastly smile. "I know that name. Wonderful." "Well, I have to go now." No, stay and tell me about these delightful exhibits." With a sudden convulsive movement, the man's hand closed on Johnny's wrist. "Tell me, you clever boy. What is that?" He had pointed to a big leather-bound book on a dictionary stand across the room. It was open, its liver-spotted pages almost glowing in the daylight, shining through the north windows. That's the Hathorn Diary and Daybook," Johnny said. "It's a rare printed copy of a diary kept for more than 20 years by John Hathorn of Salem Village." "A remarkable man," grated the stranger. "Old John Hathorn. Others repented of the witchcraft trials, but not John. He had a spine of steel, that one. It was he who boasted of whipping a Quaker woman half to death, and then casting her out to die in a snowstorm. A quick one to sniff out witchcraft was good old John Hathorn. And what is that interesting display, The man dragged Johnny about the room, demanding answers about this and that. His eyes glittered as he caught sight of the snow globe. "Bless my soul," he said, "unless my eyes deceive me, this is one of the works made by Estrius Blackleach, Ah, yes. So the card says." "Yes, sir," replied Johnny. He was desperate to get away. "It's a sealed glass dome mounted on a maple base." "Ash!" the man said in almost a hiss. "It's ash, not maple. It makes a difference in the conjuring. Old Estrius was far too cunning in the naughty ways of the secret arts to make such an elementary mistake. A pretty bauble, is it not, A soul could stare into that snow and lose himself. To think that it's almost 300 years old. The cold drifts that old Estrius stirred are still blowing, eh? Sweeping souls before them. What else of his do you have?" Johnny looked around. "Well, he made the hand mirror there, and the snuff box, and the wand beside it. There are some unidentified implements that he owned on the top shelf. And he carved some scrimshaw." The man gave Johnny's arm a painful half-twist. "These are minor. They are playthings. What about his greatest work, Where is that, my boy?" "I don't know what you mean." It came out as a terrified squeak. "Don't you indeed? It is a hand, my fine young man. I heard he carved a very pretty hand on his deathbed. You have it here somewhere, don't you?" "No," Johnny said, trying to pull his wrist away. "Please, let me go. I have to go downstairs. There's a—" "Not here," said the man, his face turning purple. "It must be here. I've checked every place except for one." He fell silent, glaring at Johnny. "I understand there is a man in town named— what is it? Childerman. No, I have it now. Childermass! Professor Roderick Childermass! He and I have much in common. We are both enthusiasts. I'm sure you know the good professor, do you not? The hand on Johnny's wrist was clamping tighter and tighter, like a constricting snake, squeezing, cold and deadly. Johnny dared not speak, but he shook his head. It was not exactly a lie, perhaps, but the strange man thought Johnny had answered his question. The hand let go at last. No, the bald stranger hissed behind his bad teeth. Then he said, well, Dustin Heights is a small town. I'm sure I will find him soon enough. He and I will have many interesting subjects to discuss. Out in the hall, the stairwell door opened, and a moment later Miss Farrington came in, speaking over her shoulder to a group of 6 or 7 bored-looking high school students who were suffering through summer school. And the Curiosities Room, she was saying, so-called because it offers many unique and absorbing exhibits from the superstitious days when... Johnny Dixon, why are you still here? Johnny was happier to see her than he had ever thought possible. Miss Farrington, this man wanted me to show him... Your duties do not include leading tours, Mrs. Farrington snapped. You will... The man in black turned his twisted smile on her. The fault is mine, dear lady. I believe I recognize your voice. Do I have the pleasure of addressing Miss Ermina Farrington? Miss Farrington blinked and poked her fingers at her hair. Why, yes, I am she. I thought so. We have conversed by telephone. It is a great honor to meet you in person. I am Matthias Mergel of Boston, and you are exactly as charming as your voice sounded. One of the high school boys snorted and turned away. His shoulders shook as he tried to look interested in the doorframe, but Miss Farrington didn't notice. She extended her hand. I am pleased to meet you, she said in a soft voice. Mr. Mergel took her hand and inclined his head over it. He slowly raised his eyes until his gaze locked on hers. I am sure that you will forgive me, the young man's honest mistake, he said. Why, yes, of course. Johnny, you had better run downstairs and do whatever it is you should be doing. Johnny hurried away, glad to escape. A few minutes later, he saw Mergel pass through the Colonial Life Room and into the foyer. In another second, the door opened and closed as he left the museum. Johnny followed and opened the front door just wide enough to peek inside. The black-clad figure strode along in the afternoon sunlight. Across West Merrimack Street, from the museum, were the gates of Hagstrom College, brick pillars crowned with concrete lions. Mergel crossed the street and walked through the gates and up the drive to an old black Plymouth parked in the shade of an aspen. Without glancing behind him, he climbed into the car, and a moment later it chugged away, leaving a very troubled Johnny Dixon wondering just who the threatening Mr. Mergel was. And that's the end of Chapter 2.